During the last days of the Second World War, the British government began to look to the future of warfare and the machines that would dominate it. Despite the secrecy of the Manhattan Project, many had already surmised the future existence of atomic weaponry and saw the need for a British nuclear force. On New Year's Day 1947, a memorandum was issued by the British government to various aircraft companies to produce a four-engined jet bomber that would replace the propeller fleet and be able to deliver nuclear weapons to the heart of any potential enemy nation. On the 3rd of October 1952, the British Empire successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. But how was it to be deployed? Several aircraft companies had leapt at the challenge presented by the 1947 memorandum, but two had been selected: Handley-Page and Avro. The Avro submission had been created by Roy Chadwick, the great designer who not 10 years previously had created the iconic Lancaster heavy bomber. Chadwick had envisaged a revolutionary delta-winged aircraft, a configuration that at the time was relatively untested. In order to be sure that the design would work, Avro first produced small research aircraft called 707s to collect data on how the wing would perform. After intensive testing and a fatal crash in 1949, a successful design was found. The intensity of the testing undertaken by Avro, however, was a major problem. By June 1941, the 707 program had found their working design, but there was still no prototype for the actual bomber. The first prototype of Avro's bomber was not to fly until the end of August 1952, a little over a month before the first British nuclear weapon was detonated. Delays in the Handley-Page program, due to the complications of their design, saw their first prototype not take to the air until December of 1952. The Air Ministry maintained support of both programs throughout their development, due to a fear of one ultimately turning out to be a failure, but also realised that they needed an aircraft to deliver nuclear weapons immediately. As a consequence of this need, the RAF turned to Vickers, who had submitted a far more conservative design in response to the 1947 memorandum. The less advanced, but easy to manufacture Vickers Valiant was in production by 1953, and fully operated by the RAF in 1955. The next year the Valiant was the first British aircraft to drop a nuclear bomb, and later that year several Valiants were to bomb targets in Egypt during the Suez intervention. A simple aircraft, it nonetheless granted Britain nuclear reach whilst her more advanced bombers were developed. In September 1952, the Avro design had made its first public appearance at the Farnborough Air Show. Escorted by two 707s, the sleek white aircraft stunned observers with the modernity of its design. 3 months later, this design would receive its official name, the Vulcan. Roy Chadwick had sadly not lived to see his greatest design take to the sky, but it was a worthy successor to his earlier great works. Display flights of the Vulcan prototypes continued, with 1955 seeing the famous Vulcan barrel roll.
And as early as 1955, test pilot Roly Falk rolled the mighty Vulcan prototype. Some moment in every sense.
By 1956, the last kinks had been worked out and the first Vulcans, designated B-1s, were delivered to the RAF, officially entering service in 1957 from their base at RAF Waddington in Lincolnshire. The Valiant was to enter service the following year, completing the trio of V-bombers in RAF service. Despite the intentions of the Air Ministry to promote multiple designs in case of one failing, the efficacy of the designs and the money already dedicated to their development saw all three remain in service into the 1980s. In early NATO planning for nuclear war, the V-Force would have formed the vital first strike element. Launching rapidly from their bases in the UK, they would have knocked out Soviet command and control points and ground force concentrations, slowing any Soviet conventional attack upon Western Europe and opening up the Soviet heartland for the second wave of bombers launching from the United States. The V-Forces would also, in the event of all-out nuclear war, have been able to threaten the western cities of the Soviet Union, such as Moscow and Kiev, before American bombers arrived. The whole fleet was brought to a full standby alert during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and would likely have been launched against such targets had any mistake been made. In such a situation, the quick takeoff time of the Vulcan was key. A skilled crew could get the enormous bomber into the air in around 2 minutes. If they took longer than 3, then they ran the risk of being obliterated by Soviet warheads before they would ever get the chance to retaliate. By 1958, a more advanced Vulcan design had already been developed. More powerful engines and electronic warfare capabilities had been worked out, and by the early 1960s the Vulcan B-2s were being delivered to the RAF. Able to deliver the Blue Steel nuclear standoff weapon, a medium-range missile, in contrast to the freefall bombs previously being used, these aircraft greatly enhanced the capabilities of the V-Force. The shooting down of Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane in 1960 led to debate in the Strategic Air Command of NATO. The V-bombers had previously flown at high enough altitudes to effectively avoid any Soviet ground fire or fighter interception. But the shooting down of the US spy plane showed that immunity to be no more. In 1963, the V-Force began training to operate at low altitudes. The compromised design of the Valiant proved incapable of coping with the stresses of this kind of operation and was retired to subordinate roles of refueling and reconnaissance. 2 squadrons of Victors were assigned to the low-level attack role, but it was the Vulcan that proved most capable. The ability of the Vulcan to launch in a very short space of time, combined with the durability of its airframe and surprising manoeuvrability, made it extremely effective in the low-level attack role. It was speculated that V-forces in this kind of operation would have a 90 to 95% chance of success. In 1969, the Polaris missile operated by the Royal Navy took over the responsibility of maintaining Britain's nuclear deterrent. This did not mark the end for the V-bombers, however. The 6 squadrons of Vulcans modified for low-level attack were kept in that role until 1982, as whilst Polaris could threaten the cities and bases of the Soviet Union, the bombers were still useful in providing tactical support to NATO forces. The immense bomb load of the Vulcan also made it a far more powerful support aircraft than the Tornadoes and Jaguars in use with the RAF at that time. From 1966 to 71, one Vulcan, XA-903, was removed from combat duties to test a new model of the mighty Olympus engine that powered the entire Vulcan fleet. This engine design was destined to power the Anglo-French supersonic airliner Concorde. It was during the Falklands conflict of 1982 that the Vulcan was to see its only combat operation. The raids of Operation Black Buck saw Vulcan bombers using conventional bombs to attack the runways of Port Stanley, and Shrike missiles to attack radar installations. As the aircraft were far too big to launch from carriers, they had to take off from Ascension Island, 6,300 kilometres from their targets. These raids were a logistical nightmare, as each Vulcan required 11 Victors, now converted for aerial refuelling, to keep them in the sky. The Vulcan itself would require refuelling 8 times during the operation, whilst several of the tankers were solely tasked with refueling their compatriots. At this stage in the life of the Vulcan, many of the aircraft were beginning to break down, and it took a frenzied period of activity to find all the parts needed to operate the Black Buck fleet, and train up the aircrews for the attacks. Nonetheless, on the 30th of April 1982, the first raid was launched. Despite several mechanical and logistical problems, Vulcan XM607, under the command of Flight Lieutenant Martin Withers, was able to approach the airfield of Port Stanley undetected and land bombs on both the runway and surrounding installations, taking the Argentine forces completely by surprise. Over the next month, 4 more successful missions were conducted against the islands, attacking various targets. The material effectiveness of the raids is debatable. Much of the damage caused was easily repaired or failed to significantly dent the Argentinian war effort, but in terms of prestige and power projection, they were a coup for the Royal Air Force and Britain as a whole. The Black Buck raids were not quite the end for the Vulcans. Though they were retired from combat duties the same year, several airframes were converted for tanker use until 1984, although such ignominious duties seem an abuse of such a splendid aircraft. After their retirement, many Vulcans were relegated to static displays, although a couple were retained by the RAF display flight until 1992. Most were sadly broken up, or used as fire dumps for ground crew training. When the RAF display flight ended operations, had the world seen the last of the Vulcan? No! Several airframes had actually been put up for sale, and one, XH-558, had been bought by a wealthy entrepreneur named David Walton, who had the intention of keeping it able to taxi under its own power as a living monument to the Cold War RAF. XH-558 was in good condition, as she had been part of the RAF display flight and previously operated in a maritime rather than the more demanding low-altitude bombing. Walton also had the foresight to buy as many spare parts as he could get his hands on. After an extensive period of repairs and a large public funding campaign aided by the National Lottery, the Vulcan to the Sky Trust finally managed, on the 18th of October 2007, to return XH-558 to the skies. For 8 years, the proud crews toured the nation, generating enormous crowds at every display. The aged aircraft, however, could not fly forever. The enormous power of the engines put great strains upon the airframe, and each season the repairs became more expensive. Finally, in the autumn of 2015, the last flying Vulcan undertook her farewell tour.